actually got 3 more weeks, but tonight and a couple more weeks. This is the first time I've taught this class. Before, when I taught it, I taught Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Lamentations. And I was doing everything I possibly could to cram all of that in 13 weeks. That became impossible. So the last time, this is the first time I've taught it with just Jeremiah and Lamentations. And it seems like I'm running out of material before I'm running out of the other things. But we just have to look at that as we go on. Just want to remind you again, in a couple of weeks, we're going to have our final. And I am working on that final. I bet I did very well on the midterm. So I still haven't got that back to you. Maybe I've got it. See me after class. I might still have your test, okay? But you made 100 on it, so if you just remember everything you got. So keep that in mind. Everybody did absolutely fantastic on this. Last time we were studying, we keyed in on the idea of Jeremiah 49, where we talked about Elam, and now we're looking at the judgment on Babylon and Babylonia. So just keep all of this in mind. We're going to see how far we get tonight. It may be that we only have a half class next week, and then I'll give you the test. So could I have gone in more detail? Yes. Could I and should I have gone? Probably. But again, we still covered a whole lot of material in this short period of time. And so hopefully we can, you've grown as a result of it as well. Last week, we really began to study and key in on the ideal of the various nations that were surrounding Judah at that time. We talked about the judgment on Egypt, verse chapter 46, and the fact, chapter 46, verse 13, that Babylonia will strike Egypt. We keyed in on the idea of the judgment on Philistia, the judgment on Moab, the judgment on Ammon, and the judgment on some of these other places, Damascus, Syria, the judgment on Edom, the judgment on Kedar and Hazor. And then in chapter 49, verse 34 through 39 is the judgment on Elam. And again, the Elamites, I didn't do enough study on that last week, so I realize now they are a descendant of Shem, and they were a pretty big nation at that particular time that was more on the south. If you were looking at a map, they're more on the southeast side of the Tigris and Euphrates River. They do come into play, especially with the Medes and the Persians whenever they finally defeat Babylon. But again, he emphasizes the idea that God will destroy them. Brother Tim Feltner asked the question a few moments ago as we were sitting there talking about some other things about God's judging all these other nations. Now, we have talked in a lot of detail about the fact that God does judge these other nations and the fact that he is righteous in doing so. We know that at the very end of time, God will judge all men. Acts chapter 17, verse 31 emphasizes that he will judge all nations by that man whom he has ordained. So we understand these things are happening. Some people question, and that's a question that we could spend a lot of time discussing. I don't know that we really have all the answers to it, is how can God judge the nations when he has not, as far as we know, I'll stress that fact, as far as we know, given them a law under that Old Testament. We know that he gave the Old Testament law, the law of Moses, to the children of Israel. But how is he judging these other nations in regard to that? It kind of goes back to me with the same idea back in Genesis chapter 15, when he made the promise to Abraham that Egypt was going to be judged because he said it's going to be 400 years because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. I have always been firmly believed that God gave his message, and think about it from the ideal of the patriarchal age, God would have given that message on down even through the time of Noah. God did judge the world at one time under Noah. Did he send prophets? Did he give laws? Did they know, or was it a situation where they did not know whatsoever? I think they had to have known for him to be able to judge them and judge them in righteousness. But the Bible is absolutely silent about sending prophets to them, sending his word. What did he say? Was it all just a word of mouth passed down from generation to generation? What I've often found truly in my own life is that if we do try to pass things down generation to generation, or not even generation to generation, but if we play the game in a classroom full of students where you're starting at one part and you give them that sentence, and then by the time you get back to the other part or the end of it, is totally nothing like it started off. I do not believe that God would judge a nation or judge any people without letting them know all along what his requirements and what his responsibilities are. The problem is we don't have any kind of record of what he was doing or how he did it. Okay, Daniel?
Sorry about that. Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 says he was a just man.
Right.
Well, the just live by faith, right?
Right.
And faith comes by hearing, and hearing by God's word. So there was somebody telling them somehow the word of God.
And I think especially in that situation with Cornelius, the Bible says he was a God-fearing man. And sometimes that word God-fearer in Acts chapter 17 refers to a Gentile that had been in contact with the Jewish nation and had come to an understanding of what his requirements were. He had just not making that final step in circumcision and becoming a proselyte. So it could be in that particular context of Acts chapter 10 that he was obeying and had heard from the Jewish nation exactly what God's responsibilities were and had enough faith in that point to where he was able to accept the preaching of the gospel at that time. And I think that's what part of comes into play there. You're right, faith does come by hearing. And even though we may not have a record of everything that God told to all the nations, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So God says they've not yet filled it up. Obviously, for there to be iniquity, there has to be a law. 1 John 3, verse 4, where there is no law, there is no transgression. You know, he says for sin, lawlessness, sin is lawlessness or transgression of the law. So we have to understand that he must have given that law to somebody somehow, and obviously used preachers and prophets to continue to teach that. Did he do it with Edom? All these other nations that surrounded them, Egypt, Edom, Ammon, Moab, a lot of these people came from the same family of Abraham and Lot and their descendants from that respect. So, and then you have the time whenever they are in the land of Canaan, the Jews, had they been doing their job like they were supposed to, which I've been mentioning the idea that if we do our job like we're supposed to, then they would really have no excuse for not knowing what God's will and what God's responsibilities are, because the Jews should have been telling them that all along. So again, did the Ammonites and all these others, did they know about God from the Jews and what they were trying to do? Probably so. Could it be that some of these Ammonites, and by the way, it's also interesting that it's not just Jeremiah, but it's also Isaiah. It's also Ezekiel, Daniel, a lot of these other talking to other nations. Obadiah was written in reference to the destruction of Assyria.
I think that's where key point may come in. That we're further studying to go over a lot of this, because we know that God warned his people here what was going to happen, that these other countries are going to come in and take them over if they didn't obey. What we don't have is, here in the end of Jeremiah, we just sort of see that God is punishing these other countries, but we don't have that he told them what to do.
Right.
And so maybe
and again, I think the best explanation I can possibly give without further revelation somehow or another, which I'm not going to receive, is that it was the Jews' job to do that, and they would be held responsible for the knowledge and what they knew at that particular time. And I think that's an important key to look at it as well, because every one of these nations were going to have some impact with the Jews. Even Babylon, even though she's not with, and Assyria, even though she is not actually around the Jews, whenever they start taking these Jews into captivity, and the Jews hopefully stay faithful to God, those that will, then they will still have a witness in those nations about what and who the true God is. And think about it with regards to Daniel. Daniel and the three Hebrew children, especially think about Daniel chapter 3, whenever Nebuchadnezzar built this huge idol, and those Jews stood up and said, no, we're not going to do this. And they had this miraculous manifestation where they were saved in the middle of a fire. Do you think that would have an impact on everybody at that time, and they would want to know more about the Jews' God? I think so. So I think in that respect, that might be even another way that would cause greater interest among the people.
So in today, relating it to today, we are God's people.
Right.
And He has told us what we're supposed to do.
Right.
If we don't do it, we understand we will be punished.
Right.
Likewise, we are told to go throughout all the world and preach the gospel. If we don't preach the gospel, if these people don't hear it, they still will be punished if they don't follow His way.
That's right. And that makes it to me even more imperative that we do a lot better job at doing that than what we've been doing. Because a lot of times we will do all of our preaching in a church building. We'll ask people to come, and the bottom line is the people that need to hear the gospel are not going, a lot of times, going to come into our church building to hear it. So we have to, as elders, deacons, preachers, and everybody else, we have to figure out better ways of getting the message out there. But then that's what, again, I want us to think about the fact how many corollaries as we've gone through this together. Times we've made the comparison with the children of Israel with the church today. They failed. How often have we? And to me, it's kind of another one of those situations where we've got to do a better job at this. And in that respect, because again, more people are going to be held accountable. It's the same idea as we've mentioned before. If we remember in Luke, I think it's Luke chapter 12, where he emphasizes the idea that some shall be beaten with many stripes, some shall be beaten with few, and it depends on what they knew. Okay, so do you think that there's going to be levels of punishment? I think so. I think so from what he says in Luke chapter 12. But again, we need to do all that we can. Hell is hell. Being beaten with few stripes or being beaten with many, you're still in that place. So I think we've really got to do a better job in trying to spread that gospel to the world. And it impresses upon me, and I appreciate the question brought up, because it impresses upon me that, I need to get out of my office more often and try to get out there and converse with people out there in the world. I love to study and try to know what God's word and will is. And again, the best way to know it is to teach it. So I've got to do a better job at that in every respect of the term. So one of the greatest faith building experiences I've been through, and I encourage everybody to do it, is to do mission work. And then we come back to our country. And what happens sometimes is we come back to our country and say, well, I've fulfilled my obligation to talk to people out there in the world by going on this 1-week mission trip. And there's a whole slew of people around me that's still lost. So we've got, now again, it's not our responsibility to save them. That's God's responsibility, but we've at least got to get them to the person who can save them. So it's something to make us all think in this respect. And I appreciate you bringing that question up, because it's something that we really need to consider, especially with regards to the church. We started last week on Babylon. In chapter 50 and 51, he's going to spend a lot of time talking about Babylon. Babylon becomes really, as you might say, you see these judgments on Babylon. I spent a lot of time last week in Isaiah 13 and 14 talking about how Isaiah had prophesied about that destruction. We remember how during the time of Hezekiah had shown everything to the emissaries of Merodach-Baladan, and how he told Hezekiah, he said, all these things that you have and you've shown them, they will take all this into captivity. We know that Babylon is the one on the ascendancy, but here in the very last part of the book, he's talking about judgment on Babylon and Babylonia. And I think there's 2 or 3 things that's happening here, as I tried to stress this last week, is the idea that God's people, all through this book, he has talked about their sins, rightly so, but he's also reminded them of the reality of the fact that Babylon will be punished as well. Isaiah does the same thing when he emphasizes in the future that Babylon will be punished as well. So for God's people to come back and to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem, to rebuild is going to be, as all of these nations are. A lot of times we look at this judgment thing and think, well, God's just judging everybody through there. But how will that encourage those Jews? Out of all the nations, you don't really find the same promises that he makes to the Jews. And what's that? I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to reestablish you in the land. I'm going to let you be my people. You'll still be my people. to think about the idea from that viewpoint. If you were a Jew reading these words from Jeremiah and you read that Babylon would be judged, wow, okay. So that's somewhat encouraging, even though Babylon has been used to punish me. Brother Dayton Kesey in the commentary, Truth for Today commentary, brought out something I hadn't thought about before, but I want you to think about it, how Jeremiah's prophecy against Babylon, all up to this point in time, they've been prophesying to the Jews about their sins and how they deserve that punishment. And as a result of that, as we've just got finished reading the historical section back earlier in Jeremiah 41, 42, so forth, we remember the fact that Nebuchadnezzar allowed Jeremiah to be released because, as far as Nebuchadnezzar was concerned, he was helping him out in advocating surrender. Now, the very nation that Jeremiah has advocated that the Jews surrender to are going to be punished. So now it's kind of like he's been preaching to his people and they got upset and they threw him in jail and cisterns and all this other stuff. So they didn't like him. If the Babylonians read these words, then they would think again, what, Jeremiah's turned on us. So he really, what is that movie that was a few years ago, A Man Without a Nation? He doesn't have anybody. All he has is God. And that is a great lesson for us too. Because at the end of the day, when we tell the truth, whether it be to the church or to people out there in the world, all we're going to have is God. Because sometimes those in the church will turn on us, sometimes those that, and of course it breaks our heart when that kind of thing happens, but sometimes even those in the world, we expect it from those in the world. We are kind of surprised sometimes when it happens among members of the church. Sometimes we again, it just reminds me, and I hope it encourages all of us to keep our faith where it needs to be. Number two, as you think about this idea of Babylon, Babylon then becomes a catchword or a code word that's talked about over and over again. We find again in Isaiah back in 750 BC, he had prophesied about it. Here in Jeremiah in 627, and now we're looking at the things leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. We've already seen that earlier in the book of Jeremiah. He's going to reiterate that in chapter 52, and I think chapter 52 is kind of a lead-in into the book of Lamentations. Again, it reminds us again about the fall of Jerusalem, and then you open up the book of Lamentations, and he's weeping about what he sees. But then you also have Ezekiel talking about the destruction of Babylon. So this becomes a key word. You will turn with me to the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 17 and 18, you have this key word of Babylon again. And so then we start getting into this whole situation. Is exactly what is he talking about here? In Revelation, it really depends, as we've talked about in times past, it depends on how people a lot of times interpret the book. Beginning in chapter 17 of Revelation, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which had full of the names of blasphemy, 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup full of abominations, and on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, harlots and of the abominations of the earth." So here he portrays a woman, a scarlet woman, and as he's talking about it, he calls her a great harlot, a prostitute. And so now we begin to try to sit down and figure out, okay, what is he talking about here? This woman is called Babylon the Great. And so then the angel says, he said, "I marveled with great amazement." And he says, well, what, verse 7, he says, the angel said, "Why did you marvel? I'll tell you the mystery of the woman. The beast that you saw was and is not will ascend out of the bottomless pit, go to perdition. Those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Here's the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. There are 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. When he comes, he must continue a short while." And then we get into that, oh man, here's these riddles. What in the world is he all talking about here? You go on to chapter 18, and let me just, I'll tell you as we go into the passage, I just want to just give this idea to you. But as you get on into chapter 18, verse 2, what does he say? Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And so does verse 4. Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. So as you read through this, you go on, and he emphasizes the idea. Listen, verse 10, chapter 18. The kings of the earth who committed fornication lived luxuriously with her, will weep and lament for her, standing at a distance, saying, Alas, alas, that great city, Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And then the rest of this chapter talks about the finality of Babylon's fall. Chapter 19 talks about heaven rejoicing over Babylon's fall. And then chapter 19, verse 11, Christ is coming up, riding on a white horse, showing the victory. So, as you look at all that, let me just briefly give you some ideas. This is more for the Revelation class, but I think it's extremely interesting that he's using this figure of Babylon and many of the things that he's going to be prophesying about using the same words that we read in the book of Jeremiah. So it would help us to understand that. Now, we know in Jeremiah's time, he's talking about an actual nation called Babylon. What in the world is he talking about in Revelation? Written about the year 69 or 96, depending on what it is. 4 or 5 interpretations. Number one, the pulpit commentary looks at this, and they say that the Babylon the Great are unfaithful members of the church. And I find that extremely interesting because a lot of times as you read through the pulpit commentary, they have various ideas, and they, like so many people do, try to come up with other various interpretations. But as I was reading this again, trying to refamiliarize myself with what the pulpit commentary said, they suggested the idea of the Babylon the Great are unfaithful members of the church that at one time were faithful. There are brethren in the Lord's church. Guy N. Woods was one of them, as well as John Himes. And if you read the Gospel Advocate commentary on the book of Revelation, they will interpret Babylon the Great as referring to the Roman Catholic Church. And they will talk about how the Roman Catholic Church has committed this harlotry with all the nations of the earth. And I could see that when you see how a lot of times the part of the argument of the church separation of church and state, and how the Roman Catholic Church used heads of state to get things done. I could see that. There are others that have the idea that this is referencing Jerusalem. And again, we talked about this in one of the first classes in the book of Revelation. Brother Foye Wallace and many in the Lord's church now are beginning to believe that Revelation was written about the year 69 AD. And that would put it about the year or so before the destruction of Jerusalem then. And Jerusalem at that time had been, again, a harlot, as it was, fraternizing with all the nations of the earth, trying to make peace and everything like that, but at the same time wanting what she wanted. So that's it. And there are those that argue that this is and could be and should be talking about the final destruction of Jerusalem. And if he's talking about the final destruction of Jerusalem there in AD 70, what is he talking about? The end of Judaism, right? And what's replacing that? Well, all through the New Testament, what is the argument is Jew or Gentile, we're all one in Christ, Galatians 3, verse 28. And he emphasizes the idea that Judaism is going to be no more. It's been replaced by Christianity. So the Jews and the whole ideal of the Jewish system has now come to an end. And the Jews have done that. And as a result of that, she is going to pay for it dearly. Then you have the idea, again, of many other brethren in the Lord's church that is talking about Rome. Again, Rome being, as I mentioned before, the great nation, the king of the earth at that time, and all the other kings of the earth are committing fornication with her. And again, we've talked about that idea, but the problem I've often had with that, and I shared this with you before, but I'll say it again, is in Revelation 1 and again in Revelation chapter 20, he emphasizes that these things must shortly come to pass. Rome didn't fall as a nation until about the year 400 AD. So more and more, I'm inclined to agree with the Jerusalem and the destruction of the Jewish nation, and that's what I believe we really talked about. And this fits in so well with Matthew 24. Then, of course, you've got all the premillennialists out there that believe that what? Rome is going to be resurrected and is now being resurrected as of this moment in time. You have the Chinese and the Russians all going to attack God's people, Israel, which was reestablished May the 14th, 1948. And that's going to usher in the premillennial reign of Christ here upon this earth, which I positively deny. Because it's just false doctrine in every sense of the term, and it places a lot of things on man and their interpretation of it. As I've said all through this class, this is the reason why we must sit down and study the Old Testament prophets and understand Revelation. If we can understand what he's talking about here in Jeremiah, then we can understand a little bit better what he's trying to say in Revelation.
One quick comment.
Okay.
And I know that you don't agree with this. You think it's Jerusalem. But if Revelation 18 is talking about the Catholic Church, then why is the faithful church asked to come out from among her? How many faithful Christians are Catholics?
That's a very valid point. And again, I would just challenge you to read all of those various writings, all those various commentaries out there to try to hear their interpretations. That's what becomes so interesting about this. And I was taught years ago, International Bible College, now Heritage Christian University. He said, listen, whenever you're reading a Bible book or you're studying a Bible book, you've got to listen to it the way they would have heard it the very first time. Try to understand it the way they would understand it, then make the applications to our days. If we did that with Revelation, that's why the key of Revelation is when we date when this book was written. And as I said, there's a lot of, most people believe it was written in 96 AD. If it was, then it has to be talking about Rome. Okay? Do what now? Because already Jerusalem had already fallen in AD 70. If it was written 69, and by the way, there are a lot of scholars that believe it was written in 69, then we have to at least include the idea that it could be talking about Jerusalem. One of the keys that convinced me was this Revelation chapter 17. And I want you to study this yourself. He said, here's the mind which has wisdom. Revelation 17, verse 9. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. Whenever I was taught this first time, I was taught that it was talking about Rome. And the professor there gave me, and by the way, you have that information, all those papers I sent to you, the historical notes I sent you. If you look at the Roman emperors, and you actually figure the Roman emperors out from what these 7 kings are talking about, 5 have fallen, 1 is. It depends on which emperor you want to start with. Some people start with Julius Caesar. But you remember after Julius Caesar was killed, the Ides of March, that whole situation with Brutus and all that other stuff, they went through a little bit of time until his grandson, Augustus, took over. So a lot of people start with Augustus. Some people start with Julius. Even if you figure out that it starts with Augustus and you follow those emperors, the one that is would be Nero. And Nero died about the year 69. He was the one that actually had sent the armies of Vespasian to try to quell the revolt of the Jews. And part of what happens, if you read very closely in Daniel chapter 9, where Daniel is prophesying about that situation, he will talk about the fact, well, let's just go there very quickly. I want to get it right, so I don't, instead of just doing it just straight from my memory. In Daniel chapter 9, again, you have this phrase, 70 weeks are determined for your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins. I'm in Daniel 9:24. Okay? All right? So 70 weeks are determined. And notice again the 70 weeks. You remember we talked about the 70 years of Jeremiah chapter 25. You have the 70 weeks. 70 weeks times 7 days is what? 490, right? So there's that phrase and that same idea, same ideology there. He says they're determined for your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy. All of those references that he uses there in Daniel chapter 9 is talking about things we definitely know what he's talking about. Finish transgression, make an end to sin. When did that happen? When Jesus died on the cross, right? He dealt with it. He dealt with it permanently. He brought in reconciliation for iniquity. He brought in everlasting righteousness. He was anointed. So he says that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. Now notice Messiah the Prince. There shall be 7 weeks, 62 weeks. The streets shall be built again in the wall, even in troublesome times. Now I'm convinced, Daniel chapter 9, verse 25, the streets shall be built again and the wall, which would suggest the idea of them rebuilding Jerusalem. Go back and read Ezra and remember that whenever they reestablished the temple, that the Samaritans were on their case the whole time. For 16 years, the temple was not built because the Samaritans stopped the work. So even in troublesome times. And then he said, after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. And notice this, but not for himself and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. And how many times have we seen through Jeremiah this idea of a flood suggests the idea of an overwhelming army? Okay. Till the end of the war, desolations are determined. And he shall confirm a covenant. But now I want you to notice the phrase, the people of the prince. Go back and you study secular history. Nero died. There was a short period of time right after Nero. It was called the year of the three emperors. There was Otho, Galba, and Vitellius, and they all tried to be emperor. They were fighting for that position. Finally, the Senate, the Roman Senate, sent for Vespasian, who at the time was surrounding the city of Jerusalem, about to take it. He pulled back his army, gave the command of his army to his son Titus. He goes to Rome. Vespasian then is crowned as emperor. He then reigns for about 10 years. Notice the people of the prince. Who's the prince? It's Titus, his son. The people of the prince shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. It wasn't that Vespasian destroyed it. Titus destroyed it in AD 70. So I find it extremely interesting that he doesn't just say the emperor or the king. He says the people of the prince destroyed it. And I see again this whole thing finding its fruition here. And so then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. 1 week would be 7 years, right? In the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offerings. Think about how often do we say Jesus' ministry lasted how long? About 3.5 years. So in the middle of the week, 7 years, then what? Sacrifice and offering is going to be done away with. Why? Because again, he died to take care of it all. The blood of bulls and goats, Hebrews 10 verse 4, can never take away sins. So Jesus died on the cross to do away with sacrifice and offerings. So everything that he talks about here in Daniel chapter 9, and especially look how interesting it is, Messiah, the prince, the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, found its fruition in what's happening in AD 70. Matthew would have written about that same event. Matthew chapter 24. He spends a lot of time, Matthew 24 and 25, and I think I've mentioned this before, but I'll again mention it again. In Matthew chapter 24 and 25, he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. They ask him, or Jesus said, do you not see one stone shall not be here upon another? And if you notice from chapter 24, verse 3 through chapter 24, verse 35, he emphasizes the idea, my heaven and earth shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. And he emphasizes the idea of this generation, the generation he was talking to at that time, will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Then in chapter 24, verse 36, and going through chapter 25, everything shifts. We can't know when Jesus is coming again. It's interesting, if you look at Matthew 24, you compare that with what's going on in Revelation. Then you compare all of that with what's going on back in Jeremiah. That emphasizes in events Jeremiah was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in Babylon's day. Now you have John using some of the very same figures, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in his day. And here, in that particular place in Revelation, he calls Jerusalem, the Jewish system, Babylon. Let's look at it one other way, and then I'm going to go on. In the book of Acts, who was persecuting the Christians the most? Was it Rome or the Jews? It was the Jews. It wasn't Rome. In fact, every situation that we read through the book of Acts where Christians come into contact with Roman authorities, the Romans looked at them first off with indifference, or they said, okay, that's just one religious sect among all the others. It wasn't until later, first with Nero, then especially during Domitian in that time frame, that the Rome tried to stamp out Christianity. But all through the New Testament, the main persecutors are the Jews. So the Jews have been in league with, think about the Jews being in league even with the idea of the Romans and getting Jesus crucified. Had the Jews had felt like what? They hated the Romans, but they used the Romans to crucify Jesus. So all of these things, I think, come into play when you look at Revelation and notice how he uses that phrase of Babylon. He uses some of the same phraseology in this passage as we also read in the book of Revelation. So I think it's important that we look at it from that viewpoint and see it from that viewpoint, because this helps us, I think, to understand Revelation that much more. All right, now back to chapter 50. Back to chapter 50. All right. Yes, brother.
I don't know if you sent this article. Someone sent me an article back to you from the Christian attorney that dealt with Daniel's prophecy of the 70 days.
Mm-hmm. Wayne Jackson, right. And look at Wayne. I think I've read his material on that. Much of what I've said was a lot of the same things he said in that same argument there. So it's interesting that a lot of the brethren do look at Daniel chapter 9, and they can definitely understand what he's talking about there. But it even provides more interest, though, while we come to the book of Revelation, and then we're struggling with trying to understand it. That's how, and that's over years of study, of my study, and that's the reason why I'm holding to Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem being that, and how Babylon becomes the code word for the destruction of that nation. Because now the Jews had always been the persecuted ones. Now they are the persecutors. And they are doing the very same thing that Babylon did. So it's extremely interesting as you see all this together. Coming back to Jeremiah 50, we are talking about literal Babylon now. And as I said earlier, this puts him between the Jews and as well as Babylon itself. Notice again, this becomes the prophecy against the land of the Chaldeans by Jeremiah the prophet. Now, I also want to bring out very quickly the idea in these last few chapters that we've been talking about the judgment of all these nations. There are some people, again, that will deny that these were written by Jeremiah. And again, it's those that do not believe in predictive prophecy, and they think it had to have been written after the Babylonian fall in 536. But again, if my God can tell Jeremiah about the events that shortly to take place, and he did, and then prophesied about it all through the book of Jeremiah, my God can tell him again about the destruction of Babylon as well. So, declare among the nations, proclaim and set up a standard, proclaim and do not conceal it, that Babylon is taken, Bel is shamed, and Merodach is broken in pieces. Merodach is another name for one of the gods. I mentioned this, I think, last week, the god Marduk. Okay? So Babylon is taken. Bel and Marduk are the two gods that are put to shame. Think about how often God judges these nations, and think about as well that as he judges these nations, again, it emphasizes that God is over all the nations, but in every one of these situations, their belief in these other gods causes them to be put to shame. And think about how all through the book of Jeremiah, he has emphasized that that's what he's gotten so upset with his own people, that they have left their God. They have left God to follow all these other gods, these gods that could not save them. So in a sense, the judgment upon the Jewish nation was a very fitting judgment because they had turned away from the only one that could save them. Her idols are humiliated, her images are broken in pieces, for out of the north a nation comes against her. And I mentioned last week a little bit, kind of talked about this, but think about all the other nations. In Jerusalem, the nations would always come from the north, but even in Babylon, Babylon was on the very tip end of the Persian Gulf, getting down toward the Persian Gulf from the Tigris and Euphrates River. So again, who's coming down from that way? It's not that they're coming down this way. Here's a map. So this is Persian Gulf. The Tigris and Euphrates River will come down something like this. Here's the Mediterranean. Over here is Jerusalem and Judea. So they would have to follow the river, and down here is the Saudi Arabian desert, right? So the Tigris and Euphrates would be down here. So what happens is Babylon actually had to come up and follow the water to come down and to attack them. But now what? Now you have Persia. And Persia, by the way, where's that today? No, very close. Oh, you're so close. It's Iran. Iran is Persia. Okay? So here you have the Medes and the Persians. The Elamites were on this side. Okay? You have the Medes and the Persians. What are they having to do? They're coming down here. Babylon's back down in here. Just as they were coming down from the north, these are coming down from the north as well to attack. Interesting. No, to attack Babylon. Because now we're talking about the destruction of Babylon, and now it's Persia coming from the north to attack Babylon. Okay? So, it's interesting that a nation shall come up against her, we shall make her land desolate, no one shall dwell therein, they shall move, they shall depart, both man and beast. In those days, in that time, says the Lord, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together, they shall come and seek the Lord their God. I mentioned last week that I think this is a prophecy. At the end, again, of the 70 weeks of Daniel, this is a prophecy of what? This is a prophecy of the children of Israel coming back. They shall ask the way to Zion with their faces toward it, saying, come, let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that will not be broken. So think about that idea for just a minute. Whenever Babylon is taken, now the Jews have the opportunity, 536, Cyrus, he's going to allow the Jews to come back, and they will have the opportunity to join themselves in a perpetual covenant that will not be forgotten. And I mentioned last week, very quickly, that this was something that they learned. They, after that 70-year captivity in Babylonia, they did not commit harlotry with other gods anymore. That idolatry was out of the question from there on out. They never once. And that's what you see in Ezra and Nehemiah when the Samaritans want to come and help them. They say, no way, we're going to do this. We're not going to intermarry with the people. We're not going to continue to do what we've done that caused us to get in a situation to begin with. And yet, interestingly enough, over a period of time, it becomes easy because, again, in Ezra 9 and Nehemiah 13, you find that they do, some of them do start intermarrying with the people in the land. And Ezra 9, Ezra will cause them to be punished as a result of that. What does he say about his people? Verse 6, my people have been a lost sheep. Their shepherds have led them astray. They've turned them away on the mountains. They've gone from mountain to hill. They have forgotten their resting place. All who found them have devoured them, and their adversaries said, we have not offended because they have sinned against the Lord, the habitation of justice, the Lord, the hope of their fathers. So he's describing his people, and he says the shepherds have led them away. They've been lost sheep. They've forgotten. They've been devoured. But they say what? God is the habitation of justice. The Lord is the hope of their fathers. And many of them do come back. A lot of them do stay in Babylon. They don't come back. When you consider that 70 years, only 42,000 come back.
Is he talking about the people that are still in captivity in Babylon right now?
Yeah, that's what he's talking about. And so notice he says, in those days, justice, the Lord, the hope of their fathers. That's why he tells them, verse 8, move from the midst of Babylon. Go out of the land of the Chaldeans. Be like the rams before the flocks. I will raise and cause to come up against Babylon an assembly of great nations from the north country. And they shall array themselves against her. She shall be captured. Their arrows shall be like those of an expert warrior. None shall return in vain. Chaldea shall become plundered. All who plunder her shall be satisfied. I mentioned last week that as you read Isaiah chapter 14, and I spent a lot of time talking about Lucifer there, talking about the king of Babylon, you find that they rejoiced over the fact that the king of Babylon had been brought down on their level. The king of Babylon had been punished like they themselves had been punished. So, why is God judging them? Verse 11 keys in on that idea. Because you were glad, because you rejoiced, you destroyers of my heritage. You have grown fat like a heifer threshing grain, and you bellow like bulls. Your mother shall be deeply ashamed. She who bore you shall be ashamed. The least of the nations shall be a wilderness, a dry land and a desert. Because of the wrath of the Lord, she shall not be inhabited. She shall be wholly desolate. Everyone who goes by Babylon shall be horrified and hiss at all her plagues. So as you read this, just as Babylon took everybody into captivity and just left the poor of the land, I want you to try to picture this if you could in your own mind, because when this happened that we read about in Jeremiah, and we're going to see about it again in Jeremiah 52, think about how it must have looked like to those Jews who returned 70 years later in the book of Ezra, and especially in the book of Nehemiah. In Ezra, they just go back and set the foundation of the temple and start temple worship again. In Nehemiah's day, the walls of the city hadn't even been rebuilt. And you read in detail what they had to do to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. I could just imagine in my mind traveling about 3 to 4 months. It was about a 4-month journey from Babylon all the way back to Jerusalem this way, because again, we're just going to shoot across the desert. They didn't jump on the nearest Airbus airplane, you know, and fly up there. They had to go up there. So it's about a 3 to 4 month journey to go there. And there's still all the remnants of the fire, all the destruction of the walls. And God says, just as you've made my people desolate, I'm going to make you desolate.
And I think that's, you know, as I studied through this part, I believe verse 11 answers the question that I had earlier, why.
Mm-hmm.
If you rejoicing is referring to the Chaldeans.
Right.
Because basically they were, that they took over God's people, and almost like in their worshiping, it was like, okay, God used them, but then he also realized that they were just.
That's exactly right.
Going on the side. The mother would have been, would that have been, the mother shall be up, would that have been the city of?
I think the mother would have been the mother of Babylon, using that in a figurative sense, the one who bore her. She had, as I said, as you read through that, and we talked about that in the history, the Neo-Babylonian, the Old Babylonian, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and so forth like that. So as you read all of this, the mother shall be deeply ashamed. Why? This was the greatest nation on earth, but guess what? It's gone now. It's gone. And again, it became a great nation in the days of Nabopolassar, but literally within about a 60 or 70 year time frame, it was over. It was gone. That was the end of it. And so the mother would be the ones that, again, the originators of the kingdom.
So when war happens, you know, the purposes of war that we go through today.
Right.
But it sounds to me like if you over celebrate the war victories out of hatred for the other people,
You'll be paying for that.
God probably doesn't.
He's not very happy about that at all. That's right. And you think about it in respect of wars, and that's a whole other subject that could be brought up a whole other time. And is there such a thing as just war and things along that line? And warfare, again, more part of the fact is the fact that they do rejoice a lot of times because of that. One of the things I've liked about the history of America is the fact that whenever we conquered a nation, we turned right back around and did all we could to rebuild that nation. Japan, Germany, a lot of those nations. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there weren't atrocities on both sides of people in the war. War is just that way. But America has always striven to rebuild a nation whenever they've conquered it. It's always been interesting to me. So you don't see these Babylonians rejoicing or trying to rebuild a nation. They're just happy they conquered them. Galatians 6, what does it say? Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. But if that's true of a man, it's also true of a nation. So it says a lot about the nation and where we are and what we need to be doing today. So what does he say in verse 14? He's going to talk about this idea. In fact, the passage that I brought out, Galatians 6, is going to be somewhat brought out in the very same thing in verse 15. He says, put yourselves in array against Babylon all around, all you who bend the bow. Shoot at her, spare no arrows, for she has sinned against the Lord. How again? You're right, brother Tim, in the fact that because they have rejoiced over their destruction of God's people. For she has sinned against the Lord. Shout against her all around. She's given her hand. Her foundations are fallen. Her walls are thrown down. For it is the vengeance of the Lord. Who's doing this? It's the vengeance of the Lord doing this, okay? And that's a key thing to think about as well. God is doing this. It's not because the children of Israel have become so mighty that they're rebelling. And God is punishing them too. As she has done, so do to her. And again, I want to stop for just a moment, and I want you to go back to Isaiah 14, where Isaiah is talking about the same phrase. When he makes this proclamation against them, he says, beginning in Isaiah 14, verse 4, how the oppressor has ceased, the golden city ceased, the Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers, he who struck the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he who ruled the nations in anger is persecuted, and no one hinders. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. Why? Because now Babylon is not conquering or oppressing them anymore. They break forth in the singing. The cypress trees rejoice over you. There's that idea of personification. Saying, since you were cut down, no woodsman has come up against us. Hell from beneath, or Sheol, is excited about you to meet you at your coming. It stirs up the dead for you, all the chief ones of the earth. It raises them up from the thrones, all the kingdoms of the nations, and they shall speak. Have you also become weak as we? Have you become like us? All of your pomp shall be brought down to Sheol, and the sound of your stringed instruments. The maggot is spread over you, and under you, and worms cover you. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. And so this is where, again, as you read this, and I mentioned this last week, the idea, you who weaken the nations, for you said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the congregation on the farther sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the cloud. I will be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, the pit. Again, remind ourselves a little bit of Daniel chapter 4 and what happened with King Nebuchadnezzar there. So it's interesting that these folks that are destroyed, that he himself has destroyed, they meet him as he goes to the grave, and they say, oh, you're just like us now. That's interesting, isn't it? So notice it goes on in Isaiah 14. Is this the man? Notice the word the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms. That's why, as I mentioned last week, we cannot, Isaiah 14, when he talks about Lucifer, we can't say that it's the devil, because this is the man who shook kingdoms, who made the world as a wilderness and destroyed its cities. So he's talking here about the king of Babylon. But I also mentioned last week that what was one of the points that the king of Babylon and a lot of these kings made? We are God. We are in this position because God has put us there. We are God's representative on earth. So you worship us. And a lot of times they did worship. Daniel chapter 3, he made that golden image. And what was the purpose? It was, I don't think there's an accident. And this again is my opinion, but I don't think there's an accident between what he saw in Daniel chapter 2 of the great image with the head of gold and the chest and arms of silver. And then the very next chapter, he talks about making a great image and demands that everybody falls down and worship it. And then in Daniel chapter 4, he's what? He's humiliated. I don't think there's an accident that they put that God had Daniel write that in that particular. I think every one of those connected together, showing how even the king of Babylon, as great as he was going to be humbled. Which again is a great idea for us as we look at that as well. So he says, her walls have been thrown down, as what's been done, she shall be done to her. Cut off the sword from Babylon, and him who handles the sickle at harvest time. For fear of the oppressing sword, everyone shall turn to his own people, and everyone shall flee to his what? To his own land. The Assyrians and the Babylonians took people captive to other lands. The Persians, and this is, I think, what endeared a lot of the world to them at that time, allowed everybody to go back to their land. So it's interesting as you read this, that that's exactly what happens, and compare it with Ezra chapter 1, 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Israel is like scattered sheep. The lions have driven him away. First, the king of Assyria devoured him. Now at last, this Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has broken his bones. Thus says the Lord, I will punish the king of Babylon and his land as I have punished the king of Assyria. I will bring back Israel to his home. He shall feed on Carmel and Bashan. His soul shall be satisfied on Mount Ephraim and Gilead. In those days, the iniquity of Israel shall be sought, but there shall be found none, and the sins of Judah, for they shall not be found, for I will pardon those whom I preserve. So there is the idea. Notice how he talks about the idea of bringing the children of Israel back, and then there's that idea of what? Forgiveness. God wanted his people back in their land, Malachi will tell us, to have a godly seed through whom Christ was to come. Then when Christ came, he would be the one to forgive, and as a result of that, he preserves them. He preserves all of them. They give their lives to Christ. Let's start there with verse 21. Let's take about a 5-minute break, okay?
had 13 PowerPoints on class and day, probably on there, that tied in with the book that I was using. What was in that book? I can't tell you off the top of my head. It's for young people. If I've been off quite a bit. It's a good study. After watching those modern day references that some resources that you can use in there. So I have, I can take my iPad and get it in. Obviously, it's Apple TV. But, it's projecting up and I also have a Bible up there.
I like to read I like to read the realize that stuff. There's the reason.
Thank you for your iPad.
I've done my thing. I think I've decided to do like this.
I look good at that. I mean, you got that? You have the iPad, you do the PowerPoint, you save it in the phone. You go in and you swipe up, you have what's called airplane. You find out where your TV is on, hit that, and then I have, the app for PowerPoint. When I just hit play, when I turn it this way, and then I go through it, I have questions, and I can have the same issues with anything you want. But you actually get it from the phone.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be the next big thing I'm going to try to learn. I always heard you could, but I just I've always used it for you. Like I said, we put trying to do everything I was using and I think about it all. So it's about time to do it. I guess I'm just tired of doing this.
Don't worry about what I tell you.
Don't do it. Okay.
It's better. It's better. If you start comparing the cost of this,
Yeah.
that much better.
That's been my hang up. That has been my hang up is the fact that I'm just not ready to plunk down what they want for some of that stuff. And I'm not a rich preacher by no means. So anyway. All right, verse 21. Isaiah chapter 50, verse 21, Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 21. Go against the land of Merathim, against it and against the inhabitants of Pekod. Waste and utterly destroy them, says the Lord, and do according to all that I have commanded you. So as he's telling these nations to punish Babylon, obviously these places, the land of Merathim and inhabitants of Pekod, are a couple of places that specifically in the Babylonian Empire that they needed to do. And so he says, you go and do all that I've commanded you. So they hear the sound of the battle. And notice it's the idea of great destruction. The hammer of the whole earth has been cut apart and broken. Babylon has become a desolation among the nations. I laid a snare for you. You have been trapped, O Babylon, and you were not aware. You have been found and also caught because you have contended against the Lord. And remember, the ultimate was back in Daniel chapter 5, where Belshazzar, as I mentioned last week, had actually taken the cups and so forth from the temple of God and desecrated them in the use of the people at that time to offer tribute to their gods in punishing or fighting against the Persians for them. As we read this, a lot of times, some people get to thinking this is talking about the final destruction, but Babylon had obviously gone through, like other nations, had gone through a series of attacks, a series of destructions, a series of these situations where they just kept coming closer and closer and closer to Babylon itself. And we remember again that very night, Daniel chapter 5, Babylon was taken was a night of drunkenness, where they had possibly to these idol gods, praying that these gods would deliver them from the Persians. and how that very night is going to be found fruition in the fact that they were going to be destroyed. The Lord has opened his armory. It's not just they have an armory of bows and arrows and so forth. He has brought out the weapons of his indignation. For this is the work of the Lord God of hosts in the hand of the Chaldeans. So as you read this, who does Jeremiah, who does God attribute this? I'm doing it, God says. Again, Persia was probably not realizing that they were being used as a tool by God. Just as Babylon did not realize they were being used as a tool by God to punish his people. So again, they were to come from the farthest border, open up her storehouses, cast her up as heap of ruin. They shall destroy her utterly. Let nothing of her be left. Slay all her bulls. Let them go down to slaughter. Woe to them, for their day has come, the time of their punishment. Flee and escape from the land of Babylon, declares in Zion the vengeance of the Lord our God, the vengeance of his temple. Now, this is another thing that we talked about earlier. What was another reason why God may have destroyed Babylon? Not just because they rejoiced over the destruction of the land, but again, he's emphasizing that this is the vengeance of God's temple, when they totally destroyed the temple and took all of those things captive. So God again is punishing them as a result of that. So call together the archers, all you who bend the bow. Notice how many times in this particular chapter he talks about those who bend the bow. And then they are to encamp about it all around. Let none of them escape. Repay her according to her work. Remember earlier we say, as she has done, so do to you, verse 15, verse 29. According as she has done, do to her. She has been proud against the Lord, against the Holy One of Israel. I challenge you to go back and study the book of Isaiah. And in fact, as I said, we will offer that as a course as well here at the Georgia School of Preaching. The Holy One of Israel becomes the favorite phrase of Isaiah. That particular phrase is used something like 50 or 60 times in the book of Isaiah itself. And the idea that Isaiah is trying to bring out is God is the Holy One of Israel. He is the only one of Israel. To a group of people that were giving themselves to all kinds of idolatry, God was the God that deserved their worship. So her young men shall fall in the street. All her men of war shall be cut off in that day, says the Lord. I am against you, most haughty one. Now here's another clue. Okay. Number one, because she rejoiced over their destruction. Number two, the vengeance of his temple. Number three, their arrogance, their pride. So again, that goes back to what Brother Feltner said earlier, the idea that pride sometimes causes us to fall. A haughty spirit always goes before the fall. Okay, he says, for that day, the time has come that I will punish you. The most proud shall stumble and fall, and no one will raise him up. I will kindle a fire in his cities, and it shall devour all around him. Thus says the Lord, the children of Israel were oppressed, along with the children of Judah. All who took them captive had held them fast. Now, who took Israel captive? No, the 10 northern tribes were taken captive by Assyria. Judah was taken captive by Babylon. Okay? And we've talked about this idea before in Ezekiel chapter 37. So all of them have been taken captive and held them fast and refused to let them go. But what does it say? Their Redeemer is strong. The Lord of hosts is his name. He will plead their case, that he may give rest to the land and disquiet the inhabitants of Babylon. So who is their Redeemer? Is God. So he's going to give rest to what land? To his land, to his people, to his one. So he says, a sword is against the Chaldeans, says the Lord, against the inhabitants of Babylon, and against her princes and her wise men. A sword is against the soothsayer, and they shall be fools. A sword is against her mighty men, and they will be dismayed. A sword is against their horses, against their chariots, and against all the mixed people who come in her midst. They shall all become like women. A sword is against her treasures, and they will be robbed. A drought is against her waters, and they will be dried up. For it is the land of carved images, and they are insane with their idols. So here's this ideal of a sword. And notice every aspect that he mentions in verse 35 through 38 attacks in some way some of the things that Babylon is guilty of. First off, they put a lot of faith and trust in their princes and their wise men. The sword's going to take them out. They put a lot of faith and trust in soothsayers, those who supposedly were able to tell the future. They put a lot of faith and trust in their armies. And he says they will be dismayed. And notice the idea of not only the mighty men, but the horses and the chariots. They, against all the mixed people who are in her midst, they shall become like women. And then the sword shall be against her treasures. So all the material wealth. Notice as you go through this, this is what a lot of times people trust in today. Oh, well, we've got good president. We've got a good Congress. We've got this. Our government's going to handle it. It's all going to be good. But it's not. Okay, then maybe it's not that. Maybe we need to trust in our omens. Let's read the astrology. Let's try to find all these ways. Maybe we'll find some good words there. Oh, we'll trust in our armies, and we'll trust in our tanks and in our weapons and the weapons of all the things that we've got. Let's trust in our material goods. Babylon trusted in every one of these things. And so what happens? Everything is brought against her. A drought is against her. It is in the land of carved images, and they are insane, he says, with their idols. The wild desert beast shall dwell there with the jackals. The ostriches shall dwell in it, and it shall be inhabited no more forever. Nor shall it be dwelt in from the generation to generation, as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, so no one shall reside there, nor son of man dwell in it. So again, a people come from the north, a great nation and many kings shall be raised up from the ends of the earth. They shall lay hold the bow and the lance. They are cruel. They shall not show mercy. Their voice shall roar like the sea. They shall ride on horses, set in array like a man against the battle against you, O daughter of Babylon. The king has heard a report about them. His hands grow dim, feeble. Anguish has taken hold of him. And again, there's that figure again, pangs as of a woman in childbirth. He shall come up like a lion from the floodplain of the Jordan, against the dwelling place of the strong. I will make them suddenly run away from her. Who is a chosen man that I may appoint over her? Who is like me? Who will arraign me? And who is that shepherd who will withstand me? So notice he says he's going to come up with him as a lion. A lion always tears and destroys. There's not a man that's going to stand against God. And he says, who is like me? Who's going to call God into question? Remember the book of Job, that whole thing got brought up again, over and over again, right? You're calling God into question. Who is that shepherd that will withstand me? So listen to the counsel that he has taken against Babylon. His purposes that he had purposed against the land of the Chaldeans. The least of the flock shall draw them out. He shall make their dwelling places desolate with them. At the noise of the taking of Babylon, the earth trembles, and the cry is heard among the nations. Why? Well, if Babylon can be destroyed, and it was the greatest nation on earth at that time, what does that say about all the other nations? Now we're going to have another group of people, the Persians. And again, that story is told mainly during the time between the Testaments. But we get glimpses of it in the book of Esther, where the Persians become the greatest nation or the greatest empire on earth until they face who? Remember? Greece. And what's so interesting about that is Greece gets together, and actually the battle of Thermopylae, and how Greece was able to actually destroy Persia and destroy their power. And again, another one of those little historical insights in Esther chapter 1, where we read about King Ahasuerus giving a big party for all of his soldiers and so forth. Most commentators seem to think, by the way, Ahasuerus is the same as Xerxes. And most of them believe that he gave this big party just as they were about to go to battle against Greece. By chapter 2, the whole Grecian situation had reversed. Xerxes had pulled back to Persia, never to attack there again. And that's when the whole situation happens with Esther. So it's interesting as you try to put all that together in a historical context, that might help us to understand all, and then to have his wife say, no, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to parade myself in front of a bunch of drunken fools. Forgive me, but that's exactly what he did. And that was just the utmost embarrassment to the king. So as you tie all that together, it's interesting how that all ties in with what the Bible says. So finally in chapter 51, I'll raise up against Babylon, against those who dwell in Leb-Kamai. He says a destroying wind, a tornado perhaps. Leb-Kamai is a word, it's the idea of the midst of those who rise up against me. So those who dwell against me, it's kind of a code word for Babylon. I'm going to rise up a destroying wind. I'll send winnowers to Babylon who will winnow her and empty her land. So again, it's the idea of a harvest, right? And we remember the fact that Jesus will talk about the idea of a harvest over and over again in Matthew chapter 13, where he describes the kingdom of heaven as like. And he describes those the harvests, the wheat and the tares, that idea of something they could use and associate with. So here again, he's punishing her. He's harvesting her. In the day of doom, they shall be against her all the way around. And again, the archer bend her bow, lifting himself up against his armor. Do not spare her young men. Utterly destroy all her army. The slain shall fall in the land of the Chaldeans, those thrust through in her streets. Israel is not forsaken, nor Judah by this, his God, the Lord of hosts, though their land was filled with sin against the Holy One of Israel. Flee from the midst of Babylon. Let everyone save his life. Do not be cut off in her iniquity. But this is the time of the Lord's vengeance. Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, that he made all the earth drunk. The nations drank her wine, therefore the nations are deranged. And I've talked about this idea of the drinking of the cup of God's wrath. So the cup of God's wrath earlier was them drinking Babylon. Now Babylon is drinking God's wrath through the Persians. So over and over again, he uses this. So she has fallen suddenly and been destroyed. Wail for her, take balm for her pain. Perhaps she may be healed. And again, you remember the idea, and I'm sure a lot of commentators, and you probably heard it as well, where that very night in Daniel chapter 5, that the city of Babylon was taken. So that's it. Has suddenly fallen and been destroyed. So he said, we would have healed Babylon, but she's not healed. Let everyone go to his own country, for her judgment reaches to heaven and is lifted up to the skies. The Lord has revealed our righteousness. Let us declare in the Zion the work of the Lord our God. So do you keep hearing these phrases where he says, God's people, Israel is not forsaken, nor Judah by his God, the Lord of hosts, verse 5. And then again, you have the Lord has revealed our righteousness, verse 10. Let us declare in Zion the work of the Lord our God. There again is that what? This ideal of hope in the midst of what? Trouble. God's people were going to be delivered. God's people were going to be saved. Make the arrows bright, gather the shield. So there's the ideal of getting all your weapons ready to fight. He's raised up the spirit of the king of the Medes, for his plan is against Babylon to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance for his temple. Set up the standard for the walls of Babylon. Make the guard strong, set up the watchmen, prepare the ambushes. The Lord has devised and done what he spoke against the inhabitants of Babylon. You who dwell by many waters, abundant in treasures, your end has come, the measure of your covetousness. The Lord of hosts has sworn by himself, I will fill you with men as with locusts, and they will lift up a shout against you. He has made the earth by his power. He's established the world by his wisdom. Now, I want you to notice this. He's talking about this destroying Babylon. Notice what he starts saying about God. God made the earth. He established the world. He stretched out the heaven. He utters his voice. There's a multitude of waters in the heavens. He calls the vapors to ascend. He makes lightning for the rain. So you see what happens. Everyone is dull-hearted. The same God who made all of this is the God who can destroy it. And he uses other nations to do it. What is idolatry? Every metalsmith is put to shame by the carved image, by his molded image is falsehood. There is no breath in them. They are futile, a work of errors. In the time of their punishment, they shall perish. As you're reading this in verse 17, read Isaiah 44, 18 through 20, Jeremiah 10, verse 14. It's always interesting as you read the Bible writers talking about, especially the prophets, talking about idolatry He talks about the fact that these idols that they worship have been cast by metallurgists. There's no breath in them. They have to be carried. Everything has to be done for them. And he says, you worship them? That's crazy. Look at what God has done for you, how he's taken care of you and blessed you, but you're worshiping this hunk of wood over here that can't do nothing. You have to pick it up and carry it with you. It's silliness, as he talks about it. The portion of Jacob is not like them. He is the maker of all things. So the portion of Jacob of verse 19 is talking not about Israel, but God. God is not like them. God is the maker of all things. Israel is the time of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name. You are my battle axe. So who's he talking to now? He's talking about the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians are his battle axe. With you I will break the nation in pieces. With you I will destroy kingdoms. With you I will break in pieces the horse and its rider, the chariot and its rider. And I'll break in pieces man and woman. With you I will break in pieces young and old, young man and maiden. I'll break in pieces the shepherd and his flock, farmer and his yoke of oxen. With you, with you, with you, with you, with you. So God is using them to do that. And I will repay Babylon for all the evil they have done in Zion in your sight. I'm against you, O destroying mountain, who destroy all the earth. Now Babylon is described as what? A mountain that's destroyed the earth. I'll stretch out my hand against you, roll you down from the rocks, make you a burnt mountain. And they shall not take for you neither stone for a corner nor stone for a foundation, but you shall be desolate forever. Set up a banner in the land, blow the trumpet among the nations, prepare the nations against her. Call the kingdoms, Ararat, Mini, Ashkenaz, appoint a general against her, cause the horses to come up like the locust. The land will tremble. Every purpose of the Lord shall be performed against Babylon. The mighty men of Babylon, verse 30, have ceased fighting. They've remained in their strongholds. The bars of her gate are broken. One runner will run to meet another, and one messenger to meet another, to show the king of Babylon that his city is taken on all sides. The passages are blocked. The reeds they burn with fire. The men of war are terrified. So now it's kind of like these last few verses. He's talking about the way it's going to end, right? It's like a threshing floor. Nebuchadnezzar has devoured me. He's crushed me. He's made me an empty vessel, swallowed me up like a monster. Therefore, thus says the Lord, Jerusalem will say, this is what God has, or Nebuchadnezzar has done to them. I will plead your case. I will bring vengeance for you. I will dry up her sea and make her springs dry. According to what I read in history, and again, there's some question as to whether or not it happened, but the night that Babylon fell, they actually, from what I understand, built the city of Babylon around the Tigris or Euphrates River. And somehow or another that they were able, the Persians were able to cut off the river and make it flow around another way to another place. And then they were able to walk under the foundation of the city on the dry riverbed. And that's how they were able to take the city that night. So as he keeps talking about this idea of springs dry, the river shut up, it seems like as we're reading from the secular history that that's exactly how they actually took the city at that time. So he says, they shall become a heap. They shall roar like lions. I will prepare their feast. I will make them drunk. They may rejoice and sleep a perpetual sleep and will not awake. I will bring them down like lambs to the slaughter. Oh, how Shishak, which is another word for Babylon, is taken. The prize of the whole earth is seized. The sea has come up over Babylon. Now, the sea, there's that idea of flood, the idea of an army. So they've overcome them. So her cities now are a desolation, a dry land, and I will punish Baal, and the nations shall not stream to him anymore. The wall of Babylon shall fall. My people go out of the midst of her. So there again, you hear these 3 or 4 times where he's calling his people out. So later, whenever 536, whenever Cyrus allows them to go out, many of them do go out. So he says, let your heart, let's see, go out of her, lest everyone deliver himself from the fierce anger of the Lord, lest your heart faint and you fear for the rumor that will be heard in the land. Could the Jews have been reading possibly these prophecies by Jeremiah? I'm sure that when many of these people have been taken from Israel and taken to captivity, they may have brought parts of the scrolls or parts of these words that Jeremiah have written? Could they, like Matthew chapter 24, seen these events take place, armies surrounding the city of Babylon, things along that line? And if they were actually living in the city itself, could they have seen this happen and flee? I think it's very possible, extremely possible.
I think it's really interesting in verse 24 when it says how it comes to Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
That was a false god.
That's right.
I mean, he really, I guess, he's making a point again that the God is gone. So if you believe in him, he's gone. But in reality,
He didn't exist to begin with.
yeah. So
And isn't it interesting that every time God does that, he does it in that land, Egypt, and the whole 10 plague situation. He does it in the lands of the people that they, that are there. When the children of Israel supposedly take the land of Canaan, they're supposed to destroy all of their false gods, but what do they wind up doing? They turn around and start worshiping these gods, right? It's just, you're sitting back looking at this thinking, man, how can insane people could be? But again, that's what's happened with Jeremiah. That's the reason why he wrote the whole book, because they were following these other gods. We remember even whenever they were leaving to go to Egypt, and they said the reason why all this happened is because we've stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven. Remember that? They still couldn't see it. But before I pick up a stone and throw at them, I hope I get a little paralysis, because sometimes some of the sins that I commit, I may not see that well. And I need a Jeremiah to help me see him. But you're all right. It's so interesting that he's going to destroy them and the very gods that they claim to worship. As Babylon, verse 49, is called the slain of Israel to fall, so at Babylon the slain of all the earth shall fall. You who have escaped the sword, get away, do not stand still, and remember the Lord afar off, and let Jerusalem come to your mind. So as the children of Israel maybe were fleeing the city, they may have read some of these words, fled, and then they would have thought about Jerusalem. And then we are ashamed because we've heard reproach, shame has covered our face. For strangers have come into the sanctuaries of the Lord's house. But the days are coming that I will bring judgment on her carved images, and throughout all the land the wounded shall groan. Though Babylon were to mount up to heaven and she were to fortify the height of her strength, yet from me plunderers would come to her. Now again, as we're reading all of this, try to remember what we read in Revelation 17 and 18. The total destruction of Babylon. And try to see how the things he says here could apply, and John uses that same figure. I'm firmly convinced that John would be writing this by inspiration, and a lot of those Jews would remember these prophecies of Jeremiah and Isaiah. And all of this would make perfect sense to them of how God was going to punish them in that respect. So he's plundering Babylon, silencing her loud voice. The noise of their utter, the plunderer comes against her, her mighty men. Every one of their bows is broken. The Lord of the God is the God of recompense. He will repay. And I'll make drunk her princes and wise men, her governors, her deputies, her mighty men. They shall sleep a perpetual sleep and not awake. The broad walls of Babylon shall be utterly broken. Her high gates shall be burned with fire. The people will labor in vain in the nations because of the fire, and they shall be weary. Now, long prophecy. 58 chapters here, or 58 verses here, but notice chapter 59, or verse 59. Boy, okay. The word of Jeremiah commanded Sariah, the son of Messiah, when he went with Zedekiah to Babylon in the 4th year of his reign. And Sariah was the quartermaster, so he wrote in a book all the evil that would come upon Babylon, all these words that were written against Babylon. And he said to Sariah, when you arrive in Babylon, see it, and read all these words, you shall say, the Lord, you have spoken against this place to cut you off, so that none shall remain in it. It shall be when you have finished reading this book that you shall tie a stone to it and throw it out into the Euphrates. I will sink and not rise from the catastrophe that I will bring upon it, and they shall be weary. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. So after it was all said and done, as I mentioned earlier, Jeremiah had been prophesying against his people. Now, in these last 2 chapters, he's prophesying against Babylon and Babylon's fall over and over and over again. And he commands another person, what? Go up when you go to Babylon, read this, so everybody may hear it, and then throw it in the river. That's the way that it's going to happen. So we can't sit back and say they didn't have a clue, because obviously they did, because they heard this warning. And this would be those captives at that time. All right? Now remember, back in chapter 39, we read of the fall of Jerusalem. Now again, here in chapter 52, we read yet again of the fall of Jerusalem. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. He reigned 11 years. So that made him 32 whenever this happened. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. And because of the anger, this happened in Jerusalem and Judah till he finally cast them out from his presence. Then Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And it came to pass in the 9th month of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem and camped against it. And it was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. In the 4th month, 9th day of the month, famine became so severe, there was no food for the people of the land. If you read this, it's just about word for what happened in chapter 39. And what all happened, how he killed his sons before his eyes and put out the king's eyes as King Zedekiah. Why is he repeating this here? Again, as I mentioned, the only reason that I can come to grips with is it may very well be that he's wanting us to remind us of what's going to happen with the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem and the temple. Obviously, the temple would all be included there. And then he emphasizes that in light of what happens. This is kind of a prelude to Lamentations. Okay? Now notice as you read of this, they leave. And it's always another interesting thing to me. I'm not going to reread all of this. You can read it as well as I do, but there's a couple of things that I find interesting. When you read in 1 Kings chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, where Solomon builds this temple to the Lord, he places a great deal of emphasis upon these bronze pillars. And he actually names these 2 bronze pillars. Okay? And every time they talk about the destruction of these Jerusalem, they really emphasize the ideal of the pillars. Verse 21 through 23. He talks about the capital of bronze that was upon it, and the second pillar and the pomegranates were the same, and how all of this was happening at that time. They were destroyed. These pillars were destroyed. And I'll be honest with you, I find it extremely interesting myself, and I'll be honest with you, I have not really studied it like I want to. But I'm often made to wonder why there's so much of an emphasis in 1 Kings when he talks about the building of these pillars that was before the temple. And now he spends a lot of time describing these pillars again as Jerusalem is being destroyed. I think there has to be some sort of significance to that, but I'll be honest with you, I don't know what it is. Why does he go into such detail describing this? Read the text, read it all together, and to me that just really just sticks out why he mentions these things so much and describes them over and over and over again, and then talks about that whole destruction. So that's interesting in that respect. It's always interesting, and if you can come up with an idea as to why, I'd like to hear it. That's something that's always been puzzlement to me. So I'm going to keep studying about it, and I challenge you to help me to study it, okay? Finally, the people taken captive to Babylon, the captain of the guard took Sariah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the second, the 3 doorkeepers. He took out of the city an officer who had charge of the men of war, and all the men who were associated, 7 men of the king's close associates, the principal scribe who mustered the people, the 60 men. He brought them out, and he put them all to death. And so these are the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive in the 7th year, 3,023 Jews. In the 18th year, he carried 832 persons, and in the 33rd year, he carried 745 persons. All the persons were 4,600. So these are the people that were taken captive. Now, obviously, there were more taken captive than just this, but it seems like as you're looking at this is the 3 events where he took them. Notice the captive in the 7th year, the 18th year, and then the 23rd year. So there's 3 carryings away. And of course, some of these would be at different times. 3,023 Jews, So all of these would be how many he would carry away in the captivity. All right. The last thing we read about in Jeremiah is the release of Jehoiakim. In the 37th year of the captivity, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and brought him out of the prison. And he made him more prominent than all the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So he ate bread regularly before the king all the days of his life. And as for his provisions, there was a regular ration given him by the king of Babylon, a portion for each day until the day of his death, all the days of his life. Okay? So there's Jeremiah. Questions or comments, thoughts, ideas? I'm open. What have you learned thus far? A bunch. As I said, Jeremiah is the longest book in the Old Testament, word-wise. So we covered a lot of ground in this book. We learned a lot of lessons. And what I'm going to do is I'll probably let us out a little bit early tonight. It's about 20 minutes till the end of class. Let us out early. Next week, we'll probably spend about an hour or two talking about Lamentations. And then I will also try to give you the final test next week. Anytime you have any questions or anything like that, please let me know. And we will go from there. Thank you for all of your comments. Thank you for everything you've done and helping me and challenging me in this. And I hope that I've caused you to do some thinking. All right? Appreciate it. Thank you, brother and sister.
Thank you.
Thank you.